Hey guys, welcome back to another cracking installment of the Matt Brown Show. Today we're going to talk about weed, baby.
Weed.
Lots and lots of weed.
Well, appreciative audience.
I know, this live audience of ours is just a bunch of weed smokers.
There must be a couple of hundred people in the auditorium here.
It's amazing. It's amazing that all of you get anything done here. Anyway. But so firstly, let's set this up. So this is going to be quite an interesting chat because it's going to touch on a lot of big things, a lot of important things. It's also going to touch on, from an economic perspective, an entrepreneurial perspective, a massive opportunity that's pending. With me today, I have Myrtle, Jules,
hello, everybody,
and Paul-Michael from Schindlers law firm, and you guys are AKA the Dagga couple, right?
We're nearly lawyers now.
Are you
It's just me holding them back.
So I guess people are saying, well, why do we have a lawyer on the show and then AKA the Dagga couple? So let's start there. What's the kind of context here, and why do we have a law firm, a very established big law firm here, and what's the relationship between all of you? Myrtle?
Well, when we were arrested, there was a whole
When
chain
we were arrested, enough said.
When you are arrested, it is advisable to get a lawyer. There was a whole turn of events, and this case became really big because we realized that we had to actually fight the Constitution, which is a big thing. And Schindlers Attorneys came through a fortuitous load of events. Schindlers Attorneys came to our aid and have been doing our case virtually pro bono for 8 years.
Wow, amazing. So it's been 8 years since that day.
It's 8 years since we were arrested, yeah. And we spent a year trying to figure out what to do and how to address it, because we could have paid a bribe easily. It was going to be about 40 grand to pay the bribe, but the thing is, the cops would have come back time and again because they'd realised we had a live one. So we decided to fight the law, and then we spent another year banging on doors in Santon, asking for some help here, and it was actually Schindler's Attorneys that stepped up to the plate in the end, because they could see a future of it, and now they, as a result of that, they are so jacked about cannabis and the law, they are literally the go-to cannabis company now. Mm-hmm. So they have turned it around that they are the go-to guys now.
Mm-hmm. So I just got to add that it would have been much cheaper to pay the bribe.
That has nothing to do with our fees.
Nothing to do with it.
So Paul-Michael, what is your perspective on this whole 8-year journey? Why did you guys get involved? What's the kind of meat and potatoes from where you guys stand here?
How we initially got involved was, it was an assignment that I wrote in final year law. It was a constitutional or a legal justification, or making out a case for the decriminalisation or legalisation of cannabis in South Africa. Through a common friend, or through the underground cannabis networks, as it were, that assignment landed with Jules and Myrtle. So when they did actually end up at Schindler's, it seemed like the obvious thing that we were going to take on their case, because there were a bunch of attorneys at Schindler's who actually believed in the fact that cannabis prohibition and the criminal prohibition of cannabis was a fundamental human rights violation. We wanted to see the end of people going to prison for something that we believed they ought not to be in prison for. That's really the long and the short of how we got involved. And as they say, it's a number of years down the line. And certainly from an entrepreneurial perspective, I think that all of those firms of attorneys who turned Jules and Myrtle away are probably regretting it now.
So I heard recently that, you must correct the wording here, because obviously wording is quite important, but has weed been decriminalised?
Yes. Yes,
Okay.
that's the word.
So what
that's
does that mean practically? Can I'll Q there smokes loads of weed. Can she go and run around like the streets and smoke it in front of cops? No worries. Or?
No.
Can I take this one? So the judgment is very clear. Cannabis has been decriminalised, but to an extent. If you read the judgment, it's very clear that you're talking about personal and use in a private space by an adult. So they're running around and smoking it in the street. You're then not in a private space. And for that matter, there are all of these interpretations to the judgment as to what is a private space, what is personal use, how much cannabis is reasonable for personal use. So it is very limited, the extent to which it has been decriminalised. It is a step in the right direction. People still have to be careful. Parliament has been given 2 years from date of judgment to promulgate laws that fill the hole that's been created by this order of constitutional invalidity. What they do in those 2 years is anybody's guess, but as I'm sure we're going to discuss a bit more on the show, there is the potential for billions upon billions of rands to be made in the cannabis industry. And if that is a legal industry, then all of those billions of rands can be taxed. And this must surely be something that is occurring to our lawmakers. So I would be very surprised personally if at the end of these 2 years, we don't at least have some sort of cannabis industry that is established by the replacement laws.
So you mentioned that this was a constitutional issue. Can you just explain a little bit more about the kind of journey that you've been on to get it to a point now where this is actually a constitutional matter? It's not just a criminal case.
Well, I mentioned that we took a year to figure out what to do. And if I go back to the day of the bust, I'd been on the same property for 20 years, growing and smoking my own weed and minding my own business and not involving anybody else in our lives. The cops arrived, they take the weed, they brutalize us psychologically for 5 hours, they stick us in a cage, we managed to get bail, and then we were so shocked, we were trying to figure out how to explain to the judge what we felt. And it just felt like my rights as a person had been violated. And this has got nothing to do with weed. This is the cops booting down the door, putting a gun in my cheek for 5 hours and swearing at me with the spit on my... Anyway, there's a whole video about the bust out there somewhere. So we had the hell in about the way we were treated, but it wasn't anything to do with cannabis. It was to do with our privacy and sitting on our own couch. So we decided to attack it from a human rights angle. It is my right to put into my body whatever I want, whether it be cannabis or anything else. So we weren't really, we've never extolled the virtues of the plant. We've never gone out and said, this stuff's great. It's medicine, it's hemp, it's fiber, it's biofuel. We are basically human rights activists, not cannabis activists. And I think that is how we managed to swing it in South African law to get this really peculiar judgment, because the judgment had nothing to do with what weed does. It's to do with privacy and your rights as an adult. So that's basically we've just come back from Vienna, and everybody in the room wants to talk to us about this very, very profound judgment that has nothing to do with cannabis. It's got everything to do with privacy.
So you're saying that this is actually what's happening, or what has transpired in your world as part of this whole process is actually now becoming a case that's being spoken about at the United Nations and stuff like that? Or how big is this event going?
Oh, it's huge. And it involves, there's 186 countries that are signatories to the 1961 Convention. And the 1961 Convention, it places cannabis in the same schedule as heroin. And it's a dangerous dependence-producing substance, which is to say that is also reflected in our South African law. Cannabis is considered that. And in 1961, there was no science around cannabis. There might have been a bit of this and a bit of that, but there wasn't the science that there is now. So those conventions were not based on science. They were not based on evidence. They were a moral judgment. But now the United Nations is a strange beast because they work on consensus. So they want to try and get all of the countries to agree. So they've taken, since 1961, and a lot of work by activists, they've got to the point now where they cannot ignore the science anymore. So cannabis is right at the top of the tree, because we always say that cannabis is the gateway drug to more saner drug policies worldwide. Yeah. Because people always say, oh, it's a gateway drug. Yes, it is. So it's a very big issue, and the activists gathered now in Vienna from all over the world, from the Far East, from South America, from everything in between. And it's really, really interesting to see the way that civil society is actually getting a voice in this beast of a place in Vienna. I mean, it really is. It's the most claustrophobic, oppressive place where there's old white men that rule the world. It really is. So we have to shout louder and louder at the UN. People say that, oh, the UN, it's a big old beast, and it doesn't really mean anything, but it really does, because if the UN change their mind, then imagine how much easier that'll make our jobs.
Because, the South African government, or most governments, hide behind the convention. So, no, we're beholden to international law. We can't change anything. But what if that law changed behind their backs? So in these next 2 years that Paul-Michael mentioned, that they've got to rewrite the law to put our rights within it. So in that time, we are probably going to go back there in March to see them or to hear them deschedule a substance, and they've never descheduled a thing in their entire lives. And while we were there waiting for them to say, we are going to deschedule THC, they completely banned 5 other things in 5 minutes. It took them 5 minutes to ban 5 more substances. They're all analogues of a thing called fentanyl, which is an incredibly powerful opioid painkiller that's killing people on the streets. They cut it into heroin and people die immediately. So they've managed to put another 5 things into the prohibition bin, and we waited. You could drop a pin in this room. And he said, judging and THC and and says, sorry, we haven't had time to sign the document. And
what does that actually mean?
Well, they've had 84 years to change the world. This is what they tried. This is why we went and spent all this money. We wanted to hear the UN change the world. We are now going to deschedule a scheduled drug. It's never happened before, and it's only THC, because last year they did it to a thing called CBD, which everybody's probably heard about now, this silver bullet cannabis compound. So now the bad boy THC is still illegal. It's still putting people in jail around the world. And we waited for them to say, we are going to deschedule it, and that document will be ratified in March next year, but they said we'll sign it in the new year.
So you're saying that the discussions have kind of been had, the decision's been made, or is this political, juxtapositioning?
It's totally political maneuvering now. It has to be.
But is your sense that the UN will do this thing, like they will actually put pen to paper?
Oh yeah. Oh yes. No, they definitely will. There's 4 schedules in the UN. First prize would be as if they actually just descheduled it completely, which it should happen, because there's a whole lot of really dangerous substances that are not scheduled because they're used as medicines. For example, ketamine is used throughout Africa as an anesthetic where there's hospitals that don't have electricity. So that's really important. So ketamine is not scheduled because it has that use. And because if they schedule it, those poor African countries won't be able to get that anesthetic. So with cannabis, it just doesn't make any sense. So they will definitely in March, we don't think they'll deschedule it, but we think that they'll take it from 4 to 2, which will certainly make a research and all of that more possible.
And Paul-Michael, when this happens, what are the consequences from a legal perspective, and what marketplaces or free markets do you think might open up as a result?
Well, as Jules alluded to, the fact of the matter is that the South African government, alongside a whole lot of other governments, have been hiding behind the fact that they have the so-called obligation, international obligation, by having signed that UN convention. What a lot of people don't know is that it's, and I'm not going to go deep into the history, but it's actually South Africa's fault that cannabis is even on the list of prohibited narcotics in the UN. This goes back to about 1912 when we were still dealing with the League of Nations. But what that then does is it takes away this excuse, as it were, this excuse to maintain the status quo and to do nothing transformative. So once the UN says that it's all right, it would be very surprising if there remain any sort of local excuses for not opening up the industry, which I think then moves us to your second question. which is that the sky is the limit with cannabis. I read a prediction recently by, I forget, but it was one of these sort of analytical statistics-based firms, quite a reputable one, which said that the global market in legal cannabis in 2025 is predicted to be at around $146 billion US. Now, we already, as South Africa, enjoy a significant chunk of the illegal cannabis market. We're supplying people around the world on the black market, including supplying all of the South Africans who want it. Now, all that it takes is to formalize the industry and to bring it out of the black market. And then you've got people who are making money out in the open from cannabis per se. And that money is getting taxed and is flowing into things like hospitals and schools. And then there are all of the knock-on industries. I mean, everybody thinks of cannabis as only a bunch of lazy stoners sitting on their couch and getting stoned. But I mean, the hemp industry, and just on that front, I mean, since the judgment, you have no idea how many high-profile corporate types are coming out of the cannabis closet saying that we've been smoking this for the last 20 years without any kind of effect. And one sort of thinks, well, where were you when we needed your voice prior to the judgment?
Big time.
But that being said, you just look at the hemp industry. That's something that's just starting to get off the ground now. I mean, the hemp fiber is a wonderfully versatile fiber. You can make cannabricks out of it and build low-cost housing and sustainable low-cost housing. I mean, the cannabis that you grow actually locks in carbon from the atmosphere. So by building a house, you're actually dealing in carbon neutrality. You can deal in cannabis credits, or as it were, carbon credits. But the very fact that you are making cannabis, you're locking in carbon, and this is from the houses that you build out of it to the socks that you knit out of it. It's for that matter, you can make a very effective biofuel out of hemp. So effective that Elon Musk could use this biofuel to fly us to Mars. You know, when I say that the sky is the limit, it's maybe the sky is not the limit.
You know, when the judge said go and grow and nobody put a limit on it, everyone has a psychoactive substance in their heads and bankies full of weed, and how much can you grow? But if this man is correct, which he is, and you can grow cannabricks and you can grow food for nutrition and you can juice it, how much do you actually need for personal use? Because Myrtle and I would like to build our next cottage on our farm. We would like to build it out of hempcrete. You add weed and lime and water and you make the brick that he's just described. So when the cops arrive and they see 8 hectares of weed, it is going to be for personal use. It is going to be used personally by me to make bricks. So we've got a lot of work to do within the law, because we're going to need some brave people to actually prove this in law. Because we joke all along for the last 2 months since this judgment, Myrtle and I joke all the time that the only people that are going to win out of this are the lawyers, because it's such a weird, open-ended judgment full of paradoxes that it's going to take a lot of legal expertise to actually go through the courts and the system to prove that what I just said is correct. If I have 5 hectares of weed, everyone will think, but that's millions of bankies. But it doesn't necessarily mean it's millions of bankies. It means that we can actually drive my bakkie to the shop with hemp ethanol and we can build a house full of weed.
This kind of feels to me like the crypto space, where the internet's had sex and something really interesting's happened. There's no regulation. It's kind of like a new free market, essentially, where anybody can trade based on supply and demand, completely peer-to-peer. So I agree with you. You know, I suppose it's kind of like saying, well, do we want institutional money to come into this market? And if we do,
it's unstoppable.
Remember, what you're kind of saying is like it's like these individualistic rights. Like, well, we have the right to do what we want. Our home is our private space, so we can grow whatever the fuck we want to grow there, and use it how we want to do it. Right? But you know, like then you got corporate and the pharmaceutical companies. You know, when they bring their capital to the table, as soon as it's open, like it's going to be a free-for-all, right? And then that begs the question, well, then do we need regulation? And if we do need regulation, then how much? Because it's kind of like saying, well, institutional money only comes to play when there is regulation.
it's very important that you've touched on the pharmaceutical industry, because this is such a double-edged sword, and it's quite a divisive issue. It's very easy to blame Big Pharma for everything. Yeah. All of our laws, one of the laws that regulates the cannabis industry presently is the Medicines and Related Substances Act and the Pharmacy Act, which means that at this point, if you're going to grow, it's only going to be if you're going to grow commercially, it's only going to be for medicinal purposes, etc., etc. But these are all laws that were written decades ago, long before anybody was thinking along the lines of cannabis. But if cannabis is medicine, and you have a person allowed to grow at home, let them grow their medicine at home, unregulated. But I still think that it's important that in an industry such as the pharmaceutical industry, if you are going to start making medicinal claims to say that this product always has this concentration, and this product has been proven to treat this form of cancer or this form of age-related wasting syndrome, whatever the case may be, if you are going to then make those claims and actually put those claims on a product or on a leaflet or in an advertisement, then you do need strict regulation. And then you do need strict licensing requirements, because then those people who are growing the cannabis need to ensure that there's no toxic mold on it, that they're not using any pesticides, and for that matter, that this strain of cannabis is not getting cross-pollinated with other strains of cannabis and is, in fact, time and time again producing the same quality of cannabis, which can then be converted into the same strain of oil, which can then be formulated into whatever registrable medicine it is. So you have to do a separation. People are perfectly within their rights to treat themselves with homegrown cannabis. Yes. But then, if you're going to make the claims, then you need to go through the red tape, is essentially what I'm saying.
We know lots of people who are growing medical marijuana to save the world and be altruistic and save the planet, but it's going to be a minefield of regulation, like PM said. It really is. I don't think I could possibly even deal with the amount of regulation that the medical fraternity is going to need, because it's like we've been shouting about it for years. It's medicine, in the hope that it might turn legalization around. It's quite cool that it is medicine and it has all these beneficial properties, but it's like the government's latched onto this now and said, okay, all right, if you want to call it medicine, we'll treat it as medicine, and it will become extremely regulated. And if you want to get into that, be my guest, get into it, but it's going to be fraught with piles and piles of rules.
Myrtle?
I think it's really important that we bring in our 350,000 registered traditional healers in South Africa, because you are not going to be able to license all of the gogos, and all of the nyangas. It's just it's not going to happen, and it mustn't happen, because those healers have been using this medicine for at least the last 600 years. Even before the Dutch came here. It was being used as a medicine and mainly as a tea. It was the Dutch who taught the indigenous people how to smoke. So one needs to go back in the history when it comes to medicine. You have to be kind of idealistic and say that there's room for everybody, because I know that the indigenous knowledge systems is the most important thing to me when it comes to medicine, because we have to give credit where credit is due for the healers, because right now, if you had to take all the South African allopathic doctors and all the healers, the knowledge of the cannabis plant as medicine lies with the healers. They know a lot more about cannabis. I've shown a gogo 2 bags of weed. And she'll be able to smell it, sniff it, taste it, whatever. And she'll say, okay, that one's really good for sleep. And that one's really good for anxiety. So there is an indigenous knowledge system that there has to be a space for. There will be, because the Gogos know how to shout, and they know how to stick together, and they know how to get what they want. So you have everything from your homegrown little thing to the Gogos to the pharmaceuticals, and there's room for everybody.
And I think that touches on a very important point, because all of these laws that presently exist around the medical industry, and I'm not now talking about the laws that relate to traditional healers, but those that I was talking about, the strict red tape around the pharmaceutical industry, all of these things were written at a time when there was no acknowledgement of the validity and legitimacy of traditional medicine. With our constitution, with our 1996 constitution, came an entire shift in thinking. I mean, not only in relation to traditional medicine, but it really was a document which said, all right, never again We used to do things this way, but now we've got to focus on human rights and equality and respect for everybody. Now, as the years have progressed, there have been laws around traditional healers, etc. But this is one of the fundamental things, and this isn't so much a legal point as it is a human point. We have shifted as a society in the way that we think, and the way is, in a sense, that we're supposed to think, which is an all-inclusive way of thinking, as Myrtle suggested, and to keep imposing what are essentially colonialist rules on what is and what isn't medicine and what you can and cannot put into your body when you want to treat yourself is a throwback to 50 years ago. You know, it goes back to the Reagan era, if not to, 300, 400 years ago. So it's that shift in thinking that needs to occur, not only in the everyday members of society, but in our parliamentarians who are tasked with promulgating these laws, because it would be very unfortunate if they made it so strictly regulated at the end of these 2 years that it's only big pharma who can afford and who are able to jump through this red tape. And you then take the industry out of the hands of the people who need it most in this country, which are the small-scale farmers and the small-scale traditional healers. If you deprive them of their ability to make money, it's a travesty.
So yesterday, this book here, I interviewed Gigi Alcock. Have you heard this Castronomics Revolution thing? So I was saying on the show, I've been covering entrepreneurship for over 3 years now and never even heard of it. Never even heard of something called the informal economy. Seen it, but never really understood it and gave it any street cred whatsoever. It dwarfs the formal economy in size. It is fucking huge, right? It really is massive. And you know what's interesting about that mindset? You're talking about, and I love the point that you made, because I 100% agree with that. If the knowledge sits with these indigenous healers and they are trading, right? They don't want regulation whatsoever. They don't want Uncle Sam knowing how much they're making, whether that's 6 grand, 3 grand, or 30 grand, or 360 million rand a year. Do you know what I'm saying? They don't want regulation whatsoever. And my fear is that if you look historically back at capitalistic societies, inevitably what happens is that government starts to poke things with the stick and goes, oh, this is shiny new, we can make a lot of money here. And guess who has the ear of the politicians? The lobbyists, right? So then inevitably, and this is my fear, is that if that happens, if red tape comes in, however that manifests itself, but if regulation does come in and it only benefits big corporates, which is inevitably likely given our previous track record, that you're going to have a very severe consequence manifest. And it's going to, think about it. You've got this market, which is let's call it $200 billion, conservatively. We don't actually know how big it could be. It could be $1 trillion industry. Who really knows? And when you've got that amount of opportunity on the table and you've got two opposing forces, one is saying, well, we don't want regulation because we want free trade. Don't come piss in our parade here. We've been doing it for 600 years. And then you've got the free market capitalists. So you've got your entrepreneurs, and then you've got the big corporates. And between those three things, that for me just smells like a melting pot that's just waiting to go off.
Additionally, is that despite all of this prohibition for so many decades, the black market has thrived. And if you overregulate, the black market will continue to thrive. It's not that those people who are growing and producing and supplying that cannabis are going to go away. So all that you do by overregulating and to an extent maintaining a prohibition, even though it's a lesser prohibition than it used to be, is you keep the black market in existence and you keep people acting as criminals. So the very human rights that we've tried to win, which is to say, don't send people to prison for something that's objectively stupid, you're going to maintain that status quo. The black market will not go away, and so long as it remains the black market, you don't get to tax it. So I think the answer is obvious.
The Californians, fully legalized for human beings, all 40 million of them in one state on the 17th of October. And as of now, 80% of trade is still on the illicit market, on the uncontrolled market.
That's crazy. Why though?
Because it's easier, because they've slapped so much tax on it. And you go to a licensed producer's dispensary and the weed is quite frankly just shit. It's not what stoners, it's not what people want. And make no mistake. If they don't give us what we want, we're going to take it anyway, because we've been doing it ever since Prohibition started as human beings. So they have to listen to us.
It's very important you can say if they don't give us what we want, but we have to know what we want. That's really, really important. And that's why Fields of Green for All, which is our NGO representing civil society in South Africa, which is all of us, normal human beings working hard to just get by in life, civil society has to know what they want. So we've written a discussion document called Proposals for Legal Regulation. And that's what we're going to be very busy with in the new years is expanding that document so that we know exactly what we want, and we can go to the government and say to them, right, we've written the law for you. We've written our ideas down for how we want that law to roll out. Now let's use that as a starting point, because the government are our employees. We all work hard to pay tax. So that we're trying that approach, and we determined that it's going to work in South Africa, that civil society can have its say. But when you say that the pharmaceuticals on the one side and the informal sector on the other side, there is a middle ground. And the only way that you can have a middle ground in an economy like South Africa with this huge informal sector is to have co-ops, is to have lots, thousands, hundreds of thousands of small little associations, so that you can counter this big corporate thing. Not a huge big national organization of cannabis growers. No, hundreds of thousands of small little associations. These are the growers in my community. We stick together. We've got one spokesperson and so on. So our little booklet is full of those ideas, but the only way to do it is lots of small associations. And we're already very good at that. Everybody knows somebody who belongs to a stokvel. Stokvels have been running for hundreds of years. People know how to organize themselves with that. They know how to organize the money. They know how to organize the paperwork, the registering of the stokvel with whatever department and all of that. So we already have magisterial districts, which everybody knows, because that's where they go and get their pension, and that's where they go and vote. So we've already got systems that are set up that we can draw on to have all of these little associations where we look after ourselves, our family, and our community first. Stop thinking big. Look after ourselves and our families. Very important.
Going back to the Carsinomics book, Myrtle read it back to back. I just got the gist of it. Schindlers came up with a terminology in a meeting that we had recently about protection of the informal sector. Because Myrtle has said all along that if the guy selling a matchbox of weed at the BP is going to be criminalized for doing so, then it's just not legal yet. Everybody has to have a slice of the pie. And the judgment says, go home and grow. Well, what if you don't have a home? What if you're on the 4th floor of an apartment? You might grow a plant. You're not going to have a year's worth of weed on a 4th floor apartment. So many people. We had a guest on our Hotbox show from Deep Slut. He's actually in deep shit. He was caught with a bunch of bankies in his house. And we'll get him off because there's a lot. The arrest was very, very badly done. But he's spending a fortune on it. And we said to him, Thabo, can you grow at home? He said, I haven't got a yard. He said, well, what about your neighbours? Can't you form a stockful? He said, there isn't anybody with a yard in the whole of Deep Slut. And if there is, you grow a plant. By the time it's a metre high, somebody's going to rob it because you're going to have to protect it with barbed wire. So it is always, always, always in law. It is those people at the bottom of the food chain that don't get a show in. And this judgment is exactly like that. We can go home to our 6-acre property and grow as much weed as we want. We have to prove its personal use, but at least we can. So what about those people? What about that informal sector that have no place to grow it whatsoever?
So this only reinforces what you were saying, PM, about is the informal trade of weed and everything that in that space will just remain the same and stay literally unregulated, or if they try and regulate, it's impossible to enforce.
Which renders it absurd to criminalize it.
So what should they do then? I mean, should they just say, listen, weed is like water, off you go?
Well, it's very difficult to say exactly what they should do, but this ties in. I was at the Cannabis Expo on Sunday in Pretoria, and I had to I gave a speech there, and because we were dealing with National Day of Reconciliation, I decided to talk about that. And I said, well, there really needs to be a reconciliation between our police service and cannabis users. And Myrtle touched on a point. She says, well, government are in fact society's employees. And the same is so for the police service, whether or not they like to hear it, because we were going back to that shift that happened in 1994 and 1996 with our constitution. And one of the things is that we transitioned from the South African police force into the South African police service. And while we're just dealing with semantics now, the meaning and the meaning underlying that transition is significant. The police are there to protect and to serve us, and that includes cannabis users. So we've got this problem at the moment of ongoing arrests for, cannabis possession despite the judgment. And what I'm saying is that there's this failure on behalf of the enforcers, the police service and the National Prosecuting Authority, to acknowledge, firstly, the judgment, which is obvious, but secondly, the fact that we have transitioned as a society and that we shouldn't be looking for reasons to put people into prison and to thereby ruin their lives. We should be helping these individuals. So to the extent that the police and the prosecution are asking, well, what do we do in the next 2 years? The answer is just to leave people alone. Let them do whatever they want to do so long as they are not harming themselves to a degree that puts a burden on the state, or to the extent that they're not harming others. Leave them alone.
So you're saying people are still being picked up?
Oh, yeah.
So, but I mean, that's ridiculous. Why is that?
Because of lots of reasons, but it's mainly communication. And also just pure bloody-mindedness. We were at Drug Policy Week in Cape Town in October, and I spoke to a very, very senior general in the police, and I had the opportunity to look him in the eye and tell him
You told him a few things.
To tell him how much I hate him, actually, because my problem is with those so-called good cops. Why don't they do something about all the bad eggs? And I can tell you quite categorically that there are 2 areas in South Africa where the arrests haven't stopped. The one is George Neisner, Plettenberg Bay, and the other one is Randburg, Honeydew, Roodepoort. And that's just because the cool drink money is drying up. So they're trying to get as much as they possibly can, because it doesn't matter whether you've got the judgment, and we tell people you print out the judgment, keep it in your car, keep our Know Your Rights booklet, know your rights. When those cops come up to you, and it's scary, and you're going to go straight to that order bank, you're going to straight to just to get out of that, because it's a scary thing, because we've got this whole hangover from all of the prohibition. So if you live in any of those 2 areas, please be very careful. And yes, the cops haven't, it certainly has diminished, but the people don't seem to be locked up, because a lot of people have been in the past been locked up overnight or for the weekend. It seems to be that people are just being intimidated, mainly for bribes, and then also to try and get a conviction. But most of the arrests that have happened since the judgment have been thrown out by the magistrate's court. But then you've gone through that trauma of the arrest. And
spent 12 grand on a lawyer and the rest of it that goes on. And you probably had your plants ripped out the ground. We're dealing with one now in Kuilsrivier outside Cape Town, a plot. A father has been growing, he had 12 plants, and he was growing it for his son who has epilepsy. And the hawks have just completely terrorized the guy. On the 3rd of December, ripped 12 plants, and he didn't have no chance to prove any personal use. He didn't have any chance to open his mouth. They just came in and railroaded him. But the cop, the general that Myrtle would talk to said, you have to understand here, we've been doing this for 80 years. We can't just stop now. So they've been jackbooting people's doors open, and it's like they're a bit twitchy now, because they literally can't. They have to have a warrant, and you have to stand your ground. You have to say in the straightest voice you can, where is your warrant? But man, when you got an R4 in your face and 2 flashlights, everything goes down very, very quickly. And people are trying to stand their ground, but the hawks in particular are still out of control. Myrtle is dealing with people that are languishing in jails that have been there for 8-9 months without bail, just for weed. So there's a lot going on. So Fields of Green for All has always stood for the harms of prohibition. And PM was at the expo, Fields of Green was at the expo, and we were kind of like the party poopers, and we were handing out documentation saying, hey, remember the mother who hasn't got her children because of some sort of court order for weed? That's still going on. She still hasn't got her kids back. What about the guy doing 3 years for possession in Lukop? He's now watching on the TV, ENCA, there's like 6,000 people at a cannabis expo. How the hell does he feel? He's doing 3 years down the hatch. So there is still a great deal to be done, but people have short memories, and every single time we do an interview since the judgment, nobody cares about children or schizophrenia anymore. They don't care about that bit. They just want to know the bottom line now.
So what are your rights now? I mean, if let's just say Q's chilling there in Randburg, growing her weeds at home, and then her door gets kicked in and they go, "Hey gangster, we want to arrest you now because you're in, you know." What are her rights, and what is her legal position? Like, what does she do? What are the practical things that she does in the first 24, 48 hours?
Don't shout at the police. Just leave it for the magistrate. And the chances are they're going to arrest you completely wrongly. They're going to bulldoze their way in. They're going to destroy evidence, and you cannot be convicted unless the police can show that you did have more plants than personal use. So what the cops should be doing is getting to a house, knocking on the door, saying, "We would like to see your weed and take a photograph of it, because we now have to prove in court that that amount of weed is for your personal use." And they won't be able to convict anybody if there's no weed. It's the same with us. 8 years ago on our charge sheet, on the forensic report, it said the cannabis was lost and misplaced. Both. It was misplaced and lost. So we haven't got any weed to prove that we had the weed. So there's no way we would they would get a conviction anyway. So it means that you're going to spend a fortune covering your arse. You're going to need a lawyer to talk for you, mostly. Myrtle does have a thing called Join the Queue. We have a legal department that is still fully operational, but it's gone very, very quiet, except for some really brutal, extenuating circumstances.
I would say the best advice is don't pay a bribe. Just don't, because that's just perpetuating the system. You won't be locked up in a cage. Just cooperate. That's really important, because the police can make your life hell. But you most probably now, since the judgment, you most probably will need a lawyer. And then that's what's quite strange, because before the judgment, we used to say you don't need a lawyer unless it's really complicated, if there's kids involved or there's firearms or something else like that, because we had a system whereby you could get your case put on hold pending on the outcome of our case. But now, since the judgment, it's become a little bit more complicated. So it is going to cost you money to get yourself a lawyer to come and argue for you, because there's not many people out there who are confident enough to argue their personal use. So it'll be expensive. So don't pay the bribe. Cooperate with the police. You won't be locked up. When you get to court, have yourself a competent lawyer. If you need a reference of somebody's name, just get hold of us.
We think it's gone quiet because everyone is now just starting to grow, especially on the high felt. Plants are like 0.5 meter high. Down the coast, they're probably 1 meter high by now. So the hawks are sitting there going, right, let's wait till they're big, fat, sticky, juicy buds and there's like 1 kilo on each plant. Then they're going to come rocking up for personal use. It's all gone quiet at the moment, but we fully expect an Easter blitz. We're waiting. They will.
I've seen a lot of stuff from Facebook. Have you guys seen stuff from Facebook? Friends growing and stuff like that.
Myrtle's mother is 78.
They're like hashtag decriminalised. I'm like, yeah, but dude, you still shouldn't be like advertising.
It's so correct. Most people go down because they're gobshiting it on Facebook. Yeah. There's pictures everywhere. Some guy's got like vape pens with 96% THC. He's in Cape Town. No, they're cool. They're great. He's brought them in from the States, but he's selling them on Facebook, and he will go down. I promise you, he'll go down. Seed sellers, they're going down. But seeds is another whole story. Seeds is a very difficult concept. You can have the seed at the moment, but if you germinate it, then all eyes are on that germination. Can you talk about seed a minute?
Yeah, it's actually quite an absurd situation in and of itself, because you've got the judgment which says to you that you can grow your own cannabis at home for your own personal consumption, but the seed is, in terms of the law, considered cannabis. It's the whole plant or any part thereof. So you can't sell seeds, because then you are drug dealing, which then begs the question, if you're somebody who wasn't already growing. So if you want to now exercise your constitutional right to grow cannabis, either you need to have been growing cannabis prior to the judgment, which means that you are committing a crime. So a crime needs to have been committed in order for you to exercise your constitutional right. Or you're supposed to get your seeds from somebody who sells it to you, but then a crime is committed. So a crime must be committed to exercise your constitutional rights. Or that person who's donating you the seeds needs to have been growing cannabis, but then they're not growing that cannabis for their personal consumption because they're growing it to give you seeds. So a crime needs to have been committed in order for you to exercise your constitutional rights. So the concept of seeds is quite literally absurd, and I don't think that it was one that necessarily weighed on the minds of the Constitutional Court judges at the time. But of course, it's one that now weighs on the minds of the police and the prosecutors. But it was surely not something that was intended, because there are certain rules of interpretation. And one of the things is that lawmakers, and that includes judges to the extent that they make law through their judgments, never intend absurd results. So there's a very good case to be made out that, in fact, the trade in seeds ought to be permitted in order to allow people to exercise their constitutional rights. But that's something that you're only eventually going to tell a judge. It's not something that when the cop is kicking down your door is going to, I mean, imagine trying to have this argument with the hawks, with the police when they're kicking down your door. It just doesn't work. So that's the absurdity of seeds.
We've actually been through the books with the lawyers. We've opened these massive legal books to try and figure out the difference between barter and trade and giving it away, just to see if there's ways around the law. But one of the other absurdities is you're only the dealer if you are giving the product. If you are receiving the product, you're not dealing, you're receiving. So you're, by law, in the clear. So the dealing part is the person that is passing them on. That is the dealer. But to receive it is not a crime. Yes?
It's
sort of.
We're dealing with
consult a lawyer.
We're dealing with a lot of grey areas. You know, unfortunately, some of the advice, in fact, a lot of the advice that we've been given is that because we have all of these grey areas now, we are going to require these so-called test cases. These are things that are going to have to come before a judge, and the judge is eventually going to have to say, "That's absurd. Get out of my court." Right. You know, but until that happens, we can only advise caution. Do not sell seeds. Do not find yourself in the middle of a drug deal, because, as Jules says, although our opinion may be that the recipient in a drug deal is not committing a crime, again, on the spot when you're busted by the police or you're facing prosecution, that's not an argument you want to be having. So rather steer clear of these grey areas until such time as Parliament or a judge gives us clarity on what all of these laws actually mean or are intended to mean.
And just don't sell all your shit on social media. You know, it's crazy. There are loads of really clever people out there doing a deal in the underground market, but they're not shouting about it. They're going about their businesses since long before the judgment.
So I want to pick up on something. So these, like that example that you used, where you have this weed convention in Pretoria or whatever, and it's on E-News and it's all a big deal, and then you've got some dude who maybe had like a bag on him prior to this judgment. And now he's sitting in jail. By the way, I was watching John Oliver last week tonight. This is another thing where the cops literally just like they manifest evidence, and there's millions of literally millions of people in America sitting in jail for small time possession. Say a similar sort of thing, where they were either using for medicinal purposes or whatever, but there was no intent to supply. They were just caught with weed on them. What do you hope will come for them? So does this, I mean, what do we do with those poor souls? Because for me, like, they do have dependents, inevitably. Look, these guys aren't like Colombian drug lords. Do you know what I mean?
The Constitutional Court was reasonably conservative. It was a landmark judgment because it's the first step in the right direction. But the Concourt did have a discretion to, and I'm now going to go into some legal terminology, but I'll explain what it means. They had the discretion to give the judgment retrospective effect, which was to say pretty much after 1996, this was never a crime. And if they had given the judgment retrospective effect, what it would have meant is that all of those people who were in prison, they should get out, and all of the criminal records should be expunged. But they declined to do that because I think, in the words of Justice Zondo, it would create legal uncertainty. So we don't have the benefit of this automatic wiping out of criminal records, etc., or the prison cells swinging open and people being released. But again, we go back to this transition in our way of thinking. We are not the society that we were 30 years ago. And what this says, what the judgment says, is that the prohibition of cannabis for personal and private use, etc., is unconstitutional. That means it always was unconstitutional, or at least since the day that the Constitution was promulgated in the society. So I would say that
just hold your mic, buddy.
There is actually a moral, not even a legal obligation. There is a moral obligation on our president, on our parliamentarians, on our national prosecuting authority, on our prison authorities, etc., to make a plan, to make sure that people's lives are not continued to be ruined by a law that the Concourt has said essentially ought never to have existed. Right. So, to the extent that I doubt he's listening, but our president really ought, with the greatest of respect, he really ought to consider pardoning every single individual who, since 1994, was caught for petty possession of cannabis.
And they should be rehabilitized into a new burgeoning industry that's deregulated.
They should be given priority. People who have got criminal records and people who have been freed from prison should be given priority in the new cannabis industry, for sure. We've got this list of 11 non-negotiable outcomes in our booklet, in our proposals, and one of those non-negotiables is the complete expungement of and the release of cannabis prisoners. We can't expect the government to say sorry to us. But I mean, really, it's a really poor show when South Africa had the most peaceful transition to democracy ever in 1994. And in the last 20 odd years, they have not bothered to relook at the cannabis laws of their own accord. We had to force the issue by taking the government to court, suing 7 different government departments, taking 8 years out of our lives to do this. The government are not going to say sorry, but the least thing that they can do, their apology can take the form of that expungement. And it always goes back to this is a reality. We have 6 grown men who have never hurt anybody, who are stuck in jail in Westville Central Prison in Durban since the 2nd of February this year. And their children are not going to see them for Christmas now. And we just can't get them out. And it's cannabis cultivation. Okay, it was a lot of cannabis cultivation, but it's just cannabis. There's no guns, there's no violence, there's no... That's the stuff that's kind of ugly that's still hanging around. But we've got a few years and we're going to eventually get rid of all of it.
Jules mentioned that I think he mentioned that the biggest harm of cannabis is getting caught with cannabis. And I keep falling back on this transition, but surely as a society, we have it in our minds that we want to help the most vulnerable in our society. Mm-hmm. Now, if it is so that somebody in fact has cannabis addiction, which is reasonably rare, but it exists. I think the science says it's about 1 in 10 people who use cannabis could get addicted to cannabis. Assuming that is having a negative impact on their lives, and that as a society we are in the business of helping vulnerable people, do you really think that by giving them a criminal record, sending them to prison, taking them away from their family, not allowing them to get a job because they've got a criminal record, is this helping these people? Right. Could you rather not take all of the money that you save by not enforcing a criminal system and put that into things like rehabilitation, actually intervening medically when you have problem cases and that sort of thing? We are not helping people through criminal prohibition. And this is the mindset that I think that Parliament and that the enforcers of our law need to go through, is that we need to target and actually think about the way that we do things, not just do it because we've been doing it this way for the last 200 years. That doesn't work anymore.
Wow. Food for thought. Just one thing we really have to talk about is what are the opportunities? I mean, assuming what we hope happens in the next 2 years, and there is a free market that's born. What are the immediate, opportunities for entrepreneurs, people who are looking to capitalize on this whole space?
Endless opportunities. There really are. It's not all about growing weed. It's not all about growing and selling weed and seeds. The support industries are enormous. We've got our esteemed weed lawyer here with us. We've got weed accountants, weed couriers, any sector. If you take any sector of the formal economy, you can apply cannabis into that. And that's what's so amazing, because you might have a small firm of accountants who kind of battling or whatever. They might like to branch out into that, study the law, study the company law that's going to come out, and help emerging entrepreneurs to do their books and keep their records and all of that. So that's the support industries. There's every type of skill needed, all the way from unskilled labor, all the way through to like highly specialized academic and scientific knowledge that is known. So really the sky's the limit when it comes to opportunities in the cannabis industry.
We recently got an email, like it was obviously like a broad release from a Canadian company that was suggesting that they supply us with their attack dogs, because they've got this whole company full of Rottweilers that are trained to look after your weed plantation, because make no mistake, that's the next thing that's going to happen. You're going to grow your weed. Some sotsy's going to come and get it. They really are. And the licensings that's sort of coming out and being formulated around the country now. There are hemp licenses being given out now by the Department of Health as we speak. I think 35 have gone out. Another 60 will go out. You need to own the property, you need a GPS position, you need a cell phone, and you need a 2-meter fence round your property. So now that 2-meter fence round 5 hectares of weed is problematic for most people. But if you do put that fence up, there is a Canadian company that will service your attack dogs, and they will come and they will feed them and house them, and they'll take them away after a week and put new dogs there so they don't get like slop. And we've still got this email. So just anything that you do can be melted into this upcoming industry. And it's like Myrtle says, it's not just about growing weed. That's the most complicated part of this, is growing weed. Don't do that. Let somebody else grow the weed. You think of something else that you can have as a niche market.
Yeah, supply growing boxes.
Yeah, look, I mean, at the Cannabis Expo, it was actually incredible already just how many ideas have surfaced. I mean, there are people who do not deal in weed whatsoever. I mean, we're talking about people who are supplying the grow kits, the nutrients, everything peripheral to cannabis without actually selling cannabis itself, and everything now that we have this constitutional right to grow at home. Well, there's a lot of people saying, I've got the best solution for you. If you buy my product or if you use my service, I'm going to ensure that you have the dankest weed growing in your broom closet as possible. Really, and I mean, seeing as we're talking about an entrepreneurial space, entrepreneurs are people with great imaginations, and we keep going back to the sky being the limit, but that really is, you've got a brand new industry, and the offshoots of that industry are only limited by the imaginations of the entrepreneurs out there.
Myrtle's mother's in her late 70s, and she's got 4 weed plants on her balcony in the old age home now. Everybody's doing it. But if she can prove personal use, then it's all going to be good. The Hawks are not going to rock up. But we told her if the Hawks do rock up, we've got her back.
Imagine they arrested a 74-year-old for growing weed.
We've had recently a guy with one leg. They threw him out of his wheelchair into the cell for the weekend. It doesn't matter about what age or your infirmities. They just see a drug user.
Look, I mean, it seems that the only industry that's really going to take a knock is the police services and airport security. I mean, other than that, I think almost every industry has the ability to grow.
And on that matter, yes, you can have weed in your pocket or your luggage in your private space and take it on holiday now to Umhlanga for the weekend. Technically speaking, that is true. And for the first time ever, on our way to Europe now, I took 10 grams of weed, my own weed, with me to Amsterdam, because in Amsterdam I've got like 1,000 rand a day drug habit. So I took weed with me, wrapped up really carefully, vacuum packed, in the bottom of the suitcase, and I took it through. We landed at Schiphol Airport. It's the best airport in the world to land at in Amsterdam. It's been decriminalised 40 years, so you've got the edge there. And we literally impassively went through the whole process, knowing that we had 10 grams on us, just to see. And I'd probably do it again.
That was not on my legal advice.
Yeah.
That was on nobody's advice. That was actually pure economics, because I literally have 1,000 rand a day. It's 600 rand a gram for California weed in the coffee shops. $600 for a gram of illegal weed in a coffee shop in Amsterdam, because Cali weed, there's no such thing as a Californian weed seed. They've locked it down, so you've got to have a clone of it to make it work. So somebody has brought clones into Amsterdam to grow them into California weed. And Cali weed, you see, when you see the signs, it says gelato 30, gelato 41, gelato 46. That is how much THC's in it just for weed. So you've now got 40% THC in a cannabis plant, and we bought some. In fact, somebody bought it for us because it was $600, but he's got sterling from England. We had our old friend there with loads of money. So he bought us a couple of grams. We sat there and we bust the whole gram in a long blade, the three of us. We stoked it up, and then walked off to the next coffee shop. And by the time we got to the next coffee shop, we needed another joint. It was a 10-minute high for $600 for the gram. True story, huh?
Quality control is really important. I think just another thing on the opportunities, seeing as we're sitting here in this amazing studio with all these beautiful millennial people here, is training and education. It really is huge opportunities. And using 21st century technology, we're not talking about sitting in a boring old classroom and listening to somebody lecture. The training and education in the cannabis industry has to be done through multimedia, through apps and shows like this, and TV, mainstream terrestrial TV. We need to totally infiltrate that with these training programs. Not only about growing weed, but about cannabis in general, because there's still a lot of ignorance around there.
So we're pivoting in January, guys. We'll be purely focusing on weed education at scale.
Michigan University has just released what they believe is the very first degree in cannabis science. So it's there, it's starting, and we need it in South Africa. Our desired outcomes tour that we did during the summer. We're telling people, if you're an educator or a teacher and you enjoy weed, start putting together a crash course, 6 weekends or whatever it is, on how to grow, how to feed, how to trim, how to preserve, because you're now going to be growing weed for the whole year, yeah? When the cop rocks up and sees 300 plants, you have to tell that cop, well, there's 8 people in the family, 6 of them need nutrition, 4 people juice it, 4 people are on oil, and you need shitloads of weed to make oil. So, yeah, how much weed do you actually need for the whole year? Because it's not one plant to dry now and smoke, and then you're going to run out and you're going to grow another plant, and you're not going to have any weed for 6 weeks because you're growing that plant. This is perpetual motion till the end of time now. You're going to have weed on your property for the rest of your life if you are a weed smoker. True story. So this whole vision of, we know of some people that have 150 plants in their backyard, but there's 8 people on the property. You do the maths. How much do you need? So every day we get an email. How much weed can I grow? And all we put is, how much do you need?
And then, of course, if you sell your house without ripping up your weed plants, does that render you a drug dealer? Who knows?
Who knows? But it would certainly enhance the property of your house. In fact, fill in the swimming pool and grow weed there. It'll be much better on the price of the house in the end.
Cool. This is awesome. So let's wrap this up. But just a same question. I'll just go down the line, starting with you, Myrtle. But why do you do this? What gets you out of bed in the morning in this space?
I love getting high. And I will never forget the smell of that police cell. It was the most disgusting thing to be locked in there. So the combination of loving getting high and remembering that smell is why I do what I do. And also for the people, you cannot believe how many amazing people we meet. It really has been a hell of a journey.
The reason we did it was because I'm sick of the man telling me what I can and cannot do, and I'm nearly 60, and in my lifetime, I've seen it get progressively worse. The government has got you by the balls now. If you don't fit in, you are almost a social felon. So I am doing this because it is everybody's right to choose what to put in their body. I don't care whether cannabis gives me testicular cancer. Put it on the box, but it doesn't matter. People smoke tobacco and it says this stuff's going to kill you, but they still do it. So the reason I am doing this is purely to get the man off my back. Him, that guy that writes all the rules and regulations, says you can and you can't. It's my couch, it's my house, it's my mind and my body.
I love the law, but I'm allergic to stupid or outdated laws. And if I could use my skills and whatever influence I may have to change laws to make them more reasonable and more rational and more focused on human rights and helping people, then I think I would take a lot more joy out of what I do. And that's why I do it, is to take some joy out of what I do.
Awesome, mate. Do you have final comments, anything?
We couldn't have done it without a really powerful bunch of lawyers behind us, and over the years we've endeared ourselves to these guys. It's like the family, and I never thought once that I'd ever like a lawyer. But he's okay, this guy.
That's high praise.
We would also never have been able to do it without our amazing supporters. We've got nearly 60,000 people on Facebook now, and huge social media reach. Wherever we go, everybody's just filled with warmth and love, and we just love the stoner community in South Africa. So that's been a huge sense of inspiration and support to us.
Preach. Thanks, guys, so much for making the time to come on the show and to have this very important conversation. It's been awesome. Thanks.
Thanks,
Great.
Matt.
Thank you very much.